once every year. Without announcing it, the chief executive officer of Harper Logistics worked an overnight shift, not in his own office, not in a meeting, not behind a desk, on the warehouse floor. He wore the same reflective safety vest as everyone else, the same steel-toed boots, the same work gloves. His name badge carried only one word: Daniel. Nothing more. He never told anyone he was coming, not because he wanted to surprise people, and certainly not because he hoped to catch someone making mistakes. Daniel Harper had stopped believing in surprise inspections many years before. He believed something far more important. He often said, "Distance is the natural enemy of leadership." Every promotion, every larger office, every executive meeting placed another small step between a leader and the people doing the work. Daniel had made himself one promise 25 years earlier: never allow those steps to become a wall. So once every year, he quietly walked back. Most employees never realized who he was. If someone asked his name, he answered honestly, "Daniel." If someone asked where he normally worked, he smiled. Upstairs. Technically, that was also true. This rainy Tuesday evening, the elevator doors opened just before 10 o'clock. Daniel stepped into warehouse number 4. He smiled at the security guard. "Good evening." "Evening." The guard checked his temporary shift badge. "First night?" Daniel smiled. "Not quite." Across the warehouse, Kevin Ellis looked up from his clipboard. 31 years old. Recently promoted to night operations manager. Ambitious. Hard-working. Determined to prove he deserved the position. The security guard pointed toward Daniel. "Your extra worker." Kevin nodded, then quietly wondered why someone from headquarters would suddenly appear on a random Tuesday night. He walked over. "You must be Daniel." Daniel offered his hand. "I am. I'm Kevin. I'll show you around." As they began walking through the warehouse, Kevin couldn't shake the feeling that something was unusual. Daniel didn't behave like a temporary worker. He looked at everything, not critically, curiously, as though he wanted to understand how the building breathed after dark. They reached the loading area. Kevin began explaining the shift. "We load outbound trucks first, then restock the sorting lanes." Daniel nodded. "How many people tonight?" 12. "And tomorrow?" 14. Daniel smiled. "So Tuesdays are usually quieter." Kevin looked surprised. "Yes." Daniel simply nodded. There was no clipboard, no inspection form, no questions about performance targets, only quiet curiosity. Kevin found himself becoming strangely nervous. He couldn't explain why. The night shift began exactly at 10 o'clock. Forklifts hummed quietly through the warehouse. Conveyor belts started moving. Barcode scanners beeped steadily in the background. The building settled into the familiar rhythm of overnight work. Daniel slipped on a pair of work gloves. Rosa Martinez approached with a pallet scanner. "You've done this before." Daniel smiled. "A few times." She handed him the scanner. "Good. We'll keep you busy." Daniel laughed. "I was hoping you would." Kevin watched the exchange. Most new workers needed half an hour to understand the equipment. Daniel picked it up naturally. Not quickly, comfortably, as though he had once spent many nights doing exactly this. For the next hour, Daniel worked without drawing attention to himself. He stacked cartons, wrapped pallets, moved empty cages back toward the loading bays. Whenever someone asked for help, he simply helped. Shortly before midnight, Kevin walked over. "Everything all right?" Daniel nodded. "Very." He looked toward the far loading dock. "I was wondering about something." Kevin smiled politely. "Of course." Daniel pointed toward a row of transport trolleys. Why are they stored over there? Kevin looked. That's where they've always been. Daniel nodded. Do you use them there? Kevin hesitated. Not really. We usually move them across the warehouse first. Daniel smiled. I wondered. Kevin looked slightly embarrassed. I suppose we've never really thought about it. Daniel nodded gently. It happens. They continued working. Half an hour later, Daniel noticed another small detail. Every employee carrying paperwork disappeared through the same fire door. He watched 3 different people make exactly the same journey. Finally, he asked Rosa, "What's through there?" The break room. Daniel looked surprised. So the coffee machine is downstairs? Rosa laughed. I wish. She pointed toward the staircase. 2nd floor. Daniel looked up. That's quite a walk. Rosa smiled. It certainly feels longer. At 3 o'clock in the morning. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. He said nothing more. But Kevin noticed. He had just learned something. Not about coffee. About the night shift. ACT2. Things you only learn at night. By midnight. The warehouse had settled into its steady rhythm. Conveyor belts rolled without interruption. Forklifts crossed paths like quiet choreography. Outside, the rain continued tapping gently against the loading bay doors. Daniel loaded another pallet beside Rosa. She smiled. You're not bad. Daniel laughed. I'll take that as a compliment. It is. She looked at the pallet. But don't get too confident. I've had 18 years to practice. For a while, they worked in comfortable silence. Finally, Daniel asked, What keeps you here? Rosa looked surprised. Most people ask why I work nights. And she smiled. I prefer your question. She adjusted another carton. My husband worked nights for many years. We hardly saw each other. When he retired, I stayed. Daniel looked puzzled. You like it? She nodded. The nights have their own rhythm. A small smile. And fewer meetings. Daniel laughed. I've noticed. A little later, Kevin joined them. We're taking our break in 10 minutes. Daniel nodded. Good. I've earned my coffee. Rosa laughed. You certainly have. The 3 walked toward the staircase. Daniel noticed everyone climbing to the 2nd floor, even those who had been working at the opposite end of the warehouse. He quietly counted the steps. 1 flight, then another. By the time they reached the break room, everyone was breathing just a little harder. The room itself was clean, but small. 1 aging coffee machine stood in the corner. 3 mismatched chairs surrounded a scratched wooden table. Someone had taped yesterday's newspaper to the wall to cover a crack in the plaster. It wasn't unpleasant. It simply felt forgotten. Daniel poured himself a coffee. He looked around. When was this room last renovated? Kevin shrugged. I honestly don't know. Rosa smiled. I think the coffee machine is older than Kevin. Kevin laughed. I wouldn't argue with that. Everyone laughed. Then, almost without thinking, they changed the subject. Nobody complained. Nobody asked for anything. They simply accepted that this was how the night shift had always been. Daniel looked around once more. Something quietly unsettled him. Not because the room was inadequate, because nobody expected it to be better. After the break, they returned downstairs. As they passed reception, Daniel noticed something else. The vending machine lights were switched off. He looked at Kevin. It doesn't work at night? Kevin shook his head. The timer switches it off after 11. Daniel looked surprised. But you're still working. Kevin smiled. I suppose whoever programmed it wasn't. Daniel smiled quietly. He said nothing. But Kevin noticed that thoughtful look again. Around 2 o'clock, a delivery truck arrived earlier than expected. The driver apologized. I'm nearly an hour ahead. Kevin immediately began rearranging the loading sequence. Without being asked, Daniel picked up another pallet jack. Within minutes, everyone had adjusted. The truck left ahead of schedule. The driver leaned out of the window. You've got a good team. Kevin smiled proudly. We do. Daniel looked around the warehouse. Nobody had panicked. Nobody had blamed anyone. Everyone had simply adapted. Quietly. Professionally. As the truck disappeared into the rain, Daniel spoke almost to himself. It's interesting. Kevin looked over. What is? Daniel smiled. People often think leadership is most visible when everything goes wrong. He watched Rosa helping another employee secure a pallet. I think it's much easier to recognize when everything keeps going right. Kevin thought about that for a long moment. He had never heard leadership described that way before. By 3 o'clock, the warehouse was quieter again. Daniel looked toward the upstairs break room, then back across the enormous warehouse floor. He already knew what the first improvement would be, not because anyone had asked, because now he understood. By 5:30, the first hint of daylight appeared beyond the loading bays. The rain had stopped. One by one, the outbound trucks rolled quietly onto the motorway. The busiest part of the night was over. Kevin looked around the warehouse with quiet satisfaction. Everything had been loaded. Nothing was behind schedule. The night shift had done good work. Daniel removed his work gloves. He smiled. Thank you. Kevin looked surprised. For what? For letting me work with your team. Kevin laughed. I think we should be thanking you. You've carried your share all night. Daniel smiled. I've enjoyed it. Just then, the warehouse doors opened. The first members of the day shift began arriving. Forklift drivers, office staff, supervisors. The familiar rhythm of a new day quietly began. A man in a dark suit crossed the warehouse floor carrying a laptop bag. He stopped. His face lit up. Good morning, Mr. Harper. Daniel smiled warmly. Good morning, James. I hope you slept well. James laughed. I think you had the shorter night. Kevin frowned. His eyes moved slowly from James to Daniel and back again. Mr. Harper? James looked surprised. You didn't know? The warehouse suddenly became very quiet. Kevin felt the color leave his face. He looked at Daniel. You are the CEO? Daniel smiled gently. Yes. Kevin stared at him. I'm terribly sorry. Daniel looked genuinely puzzled. For what? I've been explaining everything. As though. He searched for the words. As though you didn't already know. Daniel laughed softly. I'm very glad you did. Kevin blinked. You are. Daniel nodded. Last night, you weren't trying to impress your CEO. You were helping a new colleague. And that's exactly what I hoped would happen. Kevin remained silent. Daniel placed a hand lightly on his shoulder. If everyone had known who I was, I wouldn't have learned very much. He looked around the warehouse. I don't come here to discover who makes mistakes. A thoughtful pause. I come here to discover what we've stopped noticing. Kevin followed Daniel's gaze. The distant break room, the long staircase, the transport trolleys, the dark vending machine. Suddenly, he understood. Daniel smiled. You know, when I started this company, I worked nights for almost 4 years. Kevin looked surprised. I didn't know that. Daniel nodded. Most people don't. He smiled. I'd like to keep remembering it. For a moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Kevin asked, Is that why you still do this? Daniel nodded. Every year. A gentle pause. The company changes. The buildings change. The technology changes. He looked around the warehouse. So I need to keep changing too. 3 weeks later, Daniel sat in the monthly executive meeting. Department heads waited as he opened a small notebook. Not a laptop. The same notebook he had carried during the night shift. One executive smiled. I hope the overnight visit went well. Daniel nodded. It went very well. He opened the notebook. I've approved 31 improvements. Several people looked surprised. 31? Daniel smiled. Most of them are quite small. He turned the page. Relocate transport trolleys closer to loading bay 3. A page. Install a coffee machine on the warehouse floor. Another page. Extend vending machine operating hours. Another. Replace break room chairs. Another. Improve lighting beside dock 7. One director smiled. None of those are particularly expensive. Daniel nodded. No, they aren't. The finance director looked over the figures. The coffee machine is actually the cheapest improvement on the list. Daniel smiled. I thought it might be. He quietly closed the notebook. It will probably improve morale the most. The room became silent. No one argued, because everyone understood exactly what he meant. Daniel looked around the table. I spent one night walking in somebody else's shoes. A gentle pause. I discovered that small inconveniences become very large when you experience them every single day. He smiled. I'd rather spend a little money than ask people to spend another 10 years adapting. No one wrote that sentence down, yet somehow everyone remembered it.